Okay, so it's 4 p.m. in Denmark now, so I think I'll be starting, and as I mentioned, I'll be doing a brief introduction in Danish, and then I'll switch over to English once again. Hej og velkommen til Kontrast medlemsarrangement her i vores temauge om identitetspolitik og uddannelse. Mit navn det er Mikkel Andersen. Jeg er chefredaktør, og jeg er virkelig begejstret for, at vi i dag har fået besøg af professor Erik Kaufmann. Han er professor i politologi eller statskundskab, kunne man vel også kalde det, ved Birkbeck College ved University of London. Og så er han også tilknyttet det, der hedder Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. Og han har lovet at give os en lille forelæsning om udviklingen i krænkelseskultur og wokeness og identitetspolitik og polarisering her i dag. Og i dagens arrangement, der starter han altså med at have et 20 minutter plus minus oplæg omkring de her emner. Derefter så laver jeg et interview med Erik, hvor vi kommer ind på nogle af de ting, han er kommet ind på i oplægget, og også hvordan det kan relateres til en dansk kontekst, hvor den her diskussion jo er kommet til at fylde mere og mere, særligt over den seneste tid. Og til allersidst, så har vi også plads til nogle spørgsmål fra jer medlemmer af Kontrast. Dem kan I stille på to måder. I kan skrive dem i chat-kommentaren hernede under jeres Zoom-box. Der kan I se, der er den her chatfelt. Der kan I altså skrive spørgsmålene. Så vil jeg prøve at læse dem op, og I kan skrive dem på dansk eller engelsk, det er op til jer selv. Selve samtalen bliver af oplagte grunde, altså naturligvis uden undertekster, da det er direkte, men altså jeg skal nok sørge for at oversætte eventuelt engelsksprogede spørgsmål. Dem har I mulighed for at skrive hele programmet igennem. Af båndbreddemæssige hensyn, så må I gerne slå jeres egne kameraer fra. Altså hvis I kigger på der, hvor der står stop video nede i nederste venstre hjørne af jeres boks, det er bare så vi har mulighed for at optage det i bedst mulig kvalitet. And so that was my brief introduction. As I mentioned, Eric, we're very pleased to have you joining us today for this extremely interesting topic. As I also mentioned, you will be doing a presentation, which I know has the title Cancel Culture, Identity Politics and Polarization, so which will be in the vicinity of 20 minutes. So over to you, Eric.
Okay.
I
won't press that anymore. Well, thank you, Mikkel, and I'm very pleased to be here addressing you from London. I'm Canadian originally, just in case you were wondering. I want to talk to you about the phenomenon of cancel culture and identity politics. And Mikkel mentioned my CSPI report on academic freedom. I've also written a book called White Shift, which is more about polarization and populism. And I'll be speaking about that a little later on. I want to mainly take the time to sort of trace through the ideas that are behind what we think of as wokeness or identity politics, and then go on to argue that this has contributed to the political polarization we are seeing and the rise of populism that we are seeing as well. And so hopefully that will become clear as I go through the slides, which I'll do quite quickly. So I want to talk here about the beginning of an ideology, which you might think of as wokeness, but really is a broader strand called left modernism. It's not the same as simply socialism or the left. It combines one element, which is the focus on minorities, which comes from liberalism, which initially focused on rights for Catholics and Jews in the 19th century, and then focused on rights for women and then sexual minorities and racial minorities. This was seen as a liberal thing and not a socialist thing initially. Many socialists even thought of it as a bourgeois concern. But then what we have is the development of a cultural left tradition. In the US, a key figure is Randolph Bourne and the birth of multiculturalism in around the year 1916. Bourne was from a New England Anglo-Saxon background, but he very much was opposed to his own culture, talking about the Anglo-Protestants as being an uninteresting, boring group who were always trying to restrict alcohol and dancing, and then look at, on the other hand, these exotic and interesting immigrant groups from Southern and Eastern Europe, or to some extent even African Americans with their jazz. They're much more interesting. And ethnicity is a great thing for minorities. They should keep their traditions. But the majority group should not have a tradition and should try and be cosmopolitan. So that is the beginning, really, of the kind of sensibility that we're at now, whereas identity is great for minority groups and it's horrible for majorities who should seek to run away from their identity. We then have a shifting of the category. Instead of just talking about white Anglo-Saxons, as the US melting pot melts the Catholics and Jews through intermarriage to the Protestants, you then get talk about whites being the group that are boring and uninteresting, but not only boring and uninteresting, but increasingly oppressive. And that was, Bourne did talk about the WASPs being oppressive, but it wasn't a major theme as much as it becomes later. So we have this then sensitivity to minorities, which starts to develop. Minorities are not just interesting and more colorful, but they are increasingly sacred, and you cannot offend or even be seen to be offending as interpreted by a cultural leftist. In the 1960s, we get a fusion of the socialist worldview that there's an oppressor class and an oppressed class, and the world is about group conflict. That then uses the categories from liberalism of race, gender, sexuality, and applies the oppressor-oppressed, victim, oppressor worldview to these categories. And now we have this new supercharged left modernist ideology. I want to stress, though, this goes back 100 years. So this ideology emerges through both the First World War, but especially the Second World War, as the victor ideology in the cultural elite. The conservative intellectuals are more or less sidelined due to fascism in World War II. In the 1960s, we have the expansion of universities, huge expansion of universities, television media, and this allows for this sensibility to spread more broadly. And it's focused very much not on class. There's a shift of the left from class to the new identity categories, race, gender, and sexuality, which become the totemic categories of this new religion. Because this ideology is not socialism, it can adapt to capitalism or to socialism. So you get the progressive left, but you also get progressive neoliberalism or woke corporations or bourgeois bohemians. So you get a fusion of capitalist knowledge workers with this cultural progressivism. And that's very important to note. So this is not communism. This is actually an identity-based left. And I want to suggest that there are precedents for what we see. So this hashtag cancel white people, which was put in by a New York Times journalist, this idea of being anti the majority group has a longer history going back again to about the 1910s in America. Here's a phrase from an American writer in the 1920s. The Anglo-Saxon American, which is the majority ethnic group of the US, has a history of rage against minority peoples, and that the average American of this pure-blooded majority is devoid of aesthetic feelings. So this kind of sentiment of anti-majority, repudiating your own culture, has these roots in the 1910s and 20s, bohemian intellectual left modernism. You also have the roots of call-out culture, cancel culture, I would argue, in these progressive circles. So for example, in the 1930s, now, of course, you did have the Nazi threat, you did have fascism, and so maybe this was understandable. Hello?
Just a quick question. Could you elaborate on the call-out culture? Because I don't think in Danish terms that we are that much attuned to what specifically that means.
Well, yes, so this is the idea of casting people out, outside, excommunication for their opinions in an emotional way. So just pointing a finger at someone and calling them bourgeois, that's what the socialists used to do to somebody whose views were seen to contravene a sacred value. In the case of again, in the US case in the 1930s, you had liberals like Thomas Hart Benton and Frank Lloyd Wright, who were architects and artists, who were liberals, but they were interested in the American national past, and they painted in traditional idioms, and they were accused of being Nazis, right? So this is sort of an example of stretching the meaning of the term Nazi to include people who are clearly not Nazis, but it's a useful way of casting them out of the circle for transgressing the sacred value. And I would argue that we already see this in these progressive circles. And these are not communist circles. This is actually a anti-communist left that is emerging in this period. And so I want to suggest that this is the beginnings of this sensibility of people transgressing the sacred values being cast out of the tribe. And then, of course, we have, as I mentioned, this expansion of the university system, the expansion of television, And in the late 1960s in America, this is the term racism and how much it's used in English language books. In the United States, you see a big surge in the late 1960s. This is when we get the student revolts, the Black Panther movement. We have student occupations of universities, the anti-Vietnam War all of these things are happening in the late 1960s. And this is when the discourse around racism really takes off. And then we have a sort of period where it's flat. And then in the late 80s and 1990s, terms like political correctness, Afrocentrism, speech codes, universities are starting to implement these codes about what you're allowed to say and not to say on the university campus around race and gender. Well, that then takes off in the 60s. And then we come to our time, what Matthew Iglesias calls the Great Awakening. Post 2014-15, another surge, which I would argue is linked to the rise of social media and also to media platforms that are based on clicks, and they're very partisan. So you get another surge. We're living through this third Great Awakening, the previous one, which coincides with political correctness and all of the talk around Afrocentrism. That dates to the late 80s, early 90s. So we're living then in this third wave. And just to show you the term sexism, it's the same pattern. Big surge in the late 60s, second surge with political correctness, and a third surge.
I think, Eric, you have to share your screen. We are not able to see the presentation currently.
Oh no. Oh, sorry. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. But anyhow, so all I was remarking upon was that we have these three waves. In the late 1960s, the use of racism takes off. Then there's a second takeoff in the 1990s with political correctness. And then we have the current phase, the Great Awakening. These are the three, what I call the Great Awakenings, very similar to the three Great Awakenings in American Protestant Christianity, which had these waves of religious enthusiasm. So we're presently living through the third major wave of woke religious enthusiasm, or left modernist religious enthusiasm. And you can see the same pattern when we look at use of the term sexism, and that also has enjoyed an upsurge in the current period as well. I want to point out, though, that I think these ideas are older than we think they are. So already in the late 1960s, that first Great Awakening, Nathan Glazer, the famous New York intellectual, was saying that he was very enthusiastic about the student protest movement of the early 60s, the Berkeley free speech movement. But he says very quickly that movement seems to have gone 180 degrees. The issue is now that this movement has become repressive and illiberal, and it's now a cancel movement, right? So what starts out as a sort of movement, hey, we're allowed to criticize the Vietnam War or war and all kinds of things on campus, becomes something that is, oh no, wait, we don't want things taught that we don't like for emotional reasons because they're too conservative. So the right of unpopular political figures to speak without disruption on campus, the right of professors to give courses and lectures without disruption, to engage in research, the right of government and corporations to come onto campus. All of these things have been attacked by the so-called apostles of freedom. So already this left modernist movement is illiberal in its essence, and has been a threat to free speech from the beginning. And I think it's important to understand that what we've been living through is more or less just the expansion of the scale and the institutional rooting of this ideology in universities and subsequently in corporations, and also some parts of journalism. Just going to show you how much this institutional phase, the march through the institutions, we can see this is by Sam Abrams looking at the political composition of American professors. And he starts the story in the late 1980s when political correctness was emerging. That's the second Great Awakening. If we went back to the 60s, we would see that it was only about 1.5 conservatives for every one on the, 1.5 left-wing professors for every conservative. By the time we get to 1989, 90, it's about 2 to 1. So the dark blue line versus the red line, there's about 2 on the far left to everyone on the right. when by the time we get to 2013-14, it's 6-1, 6 on the left for everyone on the right. Something similar happens with journalism. Surveys of journalists show a very similar trajectory. Now that's 6-1 across the entire university, including the lower ranked universities. But if we were to focus on the top 100, the most influential universities, and focusing only on humanities and social science subjects, the politicized subjects, we see something quite different, which is ratios of more like 14-1. So here, for example, this is a study of the top 50 or 60 liberal arts colleges where Langbert actually was able to obtain people's voter registration, which people are actually registered. And so he was able to take the entire sample of these departments, look up their voter registration, and look at their ratios. And it's about 17-1 left to right in psychology, history, philosophy, and it comes down to, anthropology, communications. There are no Republicans. It's all Democrats. And in fact, Harvard recently published an article. Again, political donations is something we have a record of. In Harvard, there are 250. The ratio of donations to the Democrats over the Republicans is 250-1 at Harvard. That is not so out of line with a lot of the elite US universities. So we see an extreme skew has taken place, and that is especially noticeable in social sciences and humanities. It's essentially a monoculture now that's reproducing itself. And when you get a monoculture, it's no longer the case that people are trying to find the optimum solution that bridges between competing perspectives. The rewards go to those who exemplify the values that everyone holds. In this case, left-wing, cultural left-wing values. And there what happens is you get these upsurge of fundamentalism. Fundamentalists exemplify the values of the community. And I think this partially explains some of the upsurge we see in both the university campuses and also in the media. I mean, this is a number of media outlets, 3 of which are on the left, which are now on the left, but used to be more on the center, which is the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, but especially New York Times and Washington Post. The mention of the term racism, and we could go through sexism and a whole bunch of other terms that are associated with race, gender, and sexuality, just explodes starting in about 2014-15. And this is before Trump, linked to the rise of social media and more partisan approach to news. So you get that explosion then in coverage. Everything becomes racist. Everything becomes about sexism and transphobia and homophobia. Well, this is, again, I would say, linked to this concept of the woke identity, the left modernist identity, this cultural left identity. Now, wokeness, in one sentence, wokeness is the sacralization of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexuality groups. I would say that is a one-sentence definition of what we mean by woke. So these groups are sacred. You cannot offend them. Anything which can be interpreted as offending these idols means that you are excommunicated, you are a blasphemer. The people who are calling out, who are canceling, are virtual preachers. It's a decentered priesthood. This is not like the Catholic Church. It's more like Protestantism, where you have itinerant preachers who are trying to one-up each other in calling out signs of the devil, right? So there are also, and John McWhorter talks about this religion of anti-racism. You have taking the knee, you have jazz hands, new terms like Latinx, which Latino Americans don't even recognize, or maybe pushing to have a school or a street renamed. These are all acts of moral innovation that these preachers are undertaking. Precepts are not open to questioning because they are sacred values. America is a racist society. If you say, well, it's how racist is it? Or is it racist here but not there? Those are things you're not actually allowed to do. You're not actually allowed to be measuring and testing scientifically. That is heretical. So it's very much a religious sensibility. Thou shalt not offend the most sensitive, real, or imagined individual from a sacred protected category. What this then leads to, as I mentioned, is because of this political monoculture, you get an explosion of what we see, these no platformings, people who are disinvited from speaking on campus. And we've had these incidents in Britain as well. And even conservative government ministers who are not particularly radical have been banned at the last minute because they're seen to be somehow racist or sexist. Amber Rudd being one example. We have an explosion of incidents around speakers who are, say, gender critical feminists who believe that gender identity is linked to your biological sex. That's seen as making trans people feel unsafe. So we've had many examples of such speakers being disinvited. But these cancel campaigns are really just the tip of the iceberg. I would argue that, in fact, what's more serious is the intolerance and illiberalism in the rank and file, for example, of younger, particularly academics, to some degree younger journalists. What we've seen at the New York Times, for example, these purges of anyone whose views are seen as politically incorrect. So here, for example, I did a very large study for the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology based on 8 surveys of academics and doctoral students in the US, Canada, and Britain. What you see is that academics who are age 35 and under and PhD students age 35 and under are 2 to 4 times more intolerant than the academics aged 50 and over. And I don't think there are a number of studies that lead me to believe that this is not just about getting older, making you more tolerant, that actually the younger generation of millennials are really much less tolerant. They're not more left-wing, they're just as left-wing, but they are more intolerant. And so this problem is not a flash in the pan. It's not going to come and go. It is structurally built into the ideology which is sweeping through elite institutions in society. And what are the results of this? Well, one is moral panics, such as what we saw with the Black Lives Matter responses to police shootings, the shooting of George, or the killing of George Floyd, which is a very real tragedy, but it is completely decontextualized. So there have been more white victims than Black victims of unarmed victims of police in the US, but they are not covered by the media. A study here shows that, here's George Floyd getting 6,000 plus search results, that typically unarmed Black police shootings generate 9 times the number of search results as shootings of unarmed white victims, and roughly 1/3 of white victims generate 0 search results. That, in other words, this narrative, the sacred narrative of the oppression by Black people, of white people, and particularly by police, is what ignites the story, which makes the story newsworthy, that it's not actually a reflection of what's actually happening in society, where these studies do not show that Black suspects are more likely to be shot by police than white suspects. But you would never know that just from looking at the news, which tends to focus very heavily on subjects which resonate with that sort of woke left modernist ideology. Just really quickly, I'm going to say a few things about my book, no more than a few slides, White Shift, where I'm really trying to bring in the idea of left modernism as a contributing factor to populism and polarization. We can ask, how is it that political correctness and left modernism contribute to the rise of, for example, Trump? Well, one study, for example, asked people to read a paragraph about the importance of political correctness, of watching our language so that we don't offend minority groups, and then asked them who they were voting for in the upcoming 2016 presidential election. And what they saw was a significant increase in support for Trump amongst people who had read this paragraph compared to the people who didn't read this paragraph. And that's just one example of how, and there have been a couple of studies showing this effect of where, when people's speech is being restricted in the name of sensitivity, that is often a spur for them to support Trump in particular. If we look at the vote for Trump, prior to him becoming the president, he was selected as leader of the Republican Party in the primaries. The second most important correlate of support for Donald Trump compared to Ted Cruz and John Kasich and others was hostility. If someone was hostile to political correctness, that made them much more likely to be a Trump supporter. So we see that this emphasis on political correctness is actually blowing back into support for right-wing populism, particularly in the US. But I also want to say something else about Europe, where this is less obvious, but what you see perhaps in Europe is it's more an indirect effect, where if the mainstream parties don't want to talk too much about immigration because that's seen as politically incorrect and racially insensitive, then they can't touch that issue, and the only people that can are populists. And what we find, in fact, is that it's in societies where, certainly with the rise of the European migrant crisis, this is what really makes the AfD in Germany, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. They are the ones who are able to articulate these grievances because political correctness keeps these grievances, keeps the center parties from articulating those grievances. Now that's shifted a little bit since 2015 as the center parties start to move to address these questions. But prior to 2015, certainly in Sweden and Germany, that was not possible due to the power of left modernism in elite institutions. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to end with just the last few slides to suggest that what we're seeing increasingly is polarization around the issue of immigration, partly because this is seen as deeply politically incorrect by progressive left modernist whites and leftist parties in many Anglophone countries. And so here, for example, if you look at white Americans, about 50% wanted less immigration from the Clinton era right through to the Bush era through to the Obama era. And then by the time of Donald Trump, we get a 50-point difference between the Democrats and the Republican white Americans on this question. So we see a big split in opinion on immigration. Democrats, increasingly white Democrats, see this as racist to want to restrict immigration, and white anyone who's opposed to immigration levels being as high as they are tending to vote Republican. And that pattern is actually reproduced in other countries. In Canada, right around the same time, on a question of too many visible minorities amongst immigrants coming to Canada, between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, not much difference in opinion, sort of 30 to 50% agreeing with that statement. By the time we get to 2019, the Liberal Party supporters are much more kind of politically correct on this statement, and conservatives, again, soaking up a lot of that support for that statement. So we now have sort of 50+ point difference in Canada, similar to what we saw in America. And just to say that in Britain, the trends look quite similar. So we're seeing this kind of, this as an emerging symbolic issue, sort of separating your more kind of identity liberal types from your more conservative types. Okay, I will leave it there, and hopefully I haven't rambled on too long.
No, it was extremely interesting, and thank you very much. But I think the first question that I'd like to pose is that you in your presentation, you mentioned that around if I recall correctly, around the 60s, the ratio in academia between, at least in the social studies and humanities, was around 1.5 left self-identifying left-wingers as opposed to per conservative. That seems like a much lower ratio than the 7 to 14 in the US and Britain, respectively. I mean, what happened around that time? How did academia become so polarized?
Well, it was 1.5 to 1 across the entire university. Okay. In the social sciences and humanities, in the 60s, it was probably, well, in some disciplines around 3 to 1 left to right, and it's now about 12 to 14 to 1. So you can see two waves, I think, corresponding to the first and second great awakening. So in the, as the sort of children of the 60s enter into becoming professors, they start to change it, and then they start to, it's a spiral. So the more of them that are in that are on the left, that are in academia, the more they can have power over hiring, and they then hire people in their image, and increasingly the thing spirals, and it spirals until it becomes more or less homogenous. So that's how I think it happened. You can see a big shift between the late 1980s and the 2010s, really a big jump. And so there are papers that were written on this in the, even early 2000s. They said, okay, yes, academia is a left-wing profession, but hey, it's not so much of a problem. Now it's just extreme. And I think this is all about a sort of moralization, setting up moral boundaries so that it's not that somebody's ideas are wrong, it's that they are a bad person. And therefore we cannot hire them. And so my surveys showed that currently 40% of US academics would not hire a known Trump supporter. And a third of British academics wouldn't hire a known Brexit supporter. So that kind of gives you a sense of how much discrimination is occurring. And this has been found by paper after paper after paper in terms of refereeing journal articles, promotion applications, grant bid submissions. There's quite a significant amount of political discrimination.
Yeah, because I think, as you mentioned, there is, of course, the cancel culture, the active cancellation of various events. I mean, there was this Charles Murray incident in the U.S. where this one of the authors of the Bell Curve was almost assaulted. I think actually one of the people helping him was physically assaulted. And there have been these. There was also Milo Yiannopoulos and several others, and I'm sure that there have been quite a few similar cases in the UK. But in your writings, I know that you're saying that the real stifling, the real problem is that there seems to be this anxiety amongst people of a more right-wing or conservative outlook. They seem to simply be uninterested in participating in environments that seems to be so partisan.
Yeah, so I mentioned that, often from progressive, they'll say, well, you have a few of these incidents, maybe 65 incidents that have been recorded on websites over the past year, and there are 500,000 academics, so this is just a drop in the ocean. And, I think, even though I think that that is actually wrong, I think they have a point in that this is not the biggest problem. I mean, the biggest problem is within that 500,000 academics, anyone who's in the political minority feels very powerful pressure to censor themselves. So this loss of freedom. So in the surveys I did of US and Canadian academics in the social sciences and humanities, it's something like 7 out of 10 say their departments are a hostile climate for their beliefs. And in about 3/4 of US and British social science humanities academics on the right say that they self-censor in their work. So the big loss of freedom is really happening in terms of people feeling this chilly effect where they have to watch what they say. They can't research this question. You don't want to research the woke left because you're not going to get published, and you're not going to be invited to this and that, and your career won't progress, and your colleagues won't want to sit down to lunch with you. And so there are all these sorts of reasons why you would keep your mouth shut. So certain questions never get asked. Certain perspectives. Why is there a achievement gap, say, between say Black and white Americans in school? Well, you would never actually ask questions about culture, about family. You could only phrase it as structural racism and so on. So we aren't getting a proper picture of the proper drivers of inequalities or other kinds of differences. So it's really warping the entire production of knowledge in the university and shutting down entire questions.
One thing is, of course, the bias within the academia, or the vast majority of people voting to the left of center. But another thing is, and I think you touched upon it briefly, there is this kind of sanctification of certain kind of viewpoints regarding the historical sufferings of various minorities. In Denmark, we have this. I think in terms of wokeness within academia, it's a discussion which is much. I think we're quite a few years behind in Denmark. We have had some instances which have been heavily reported. We had this biology teacher at if I could recall correctly, the University of Copenhagen, who was taken to task by students because he said that there were 2 genders, which are really not supposed to. And I know you've also researched that even people on the left seem to be quite afraid of saying something which could be construed as transphobic. But is there something which which could be described as qualitatively different within this wokeness movement, as opposed to what could be called the political correctness of the 80s, or is it just a development?
I actually don't think I don't think the differences are very substantial. I think they are very similar. And I'm one of these people who sort of says, you can look back and see things in the 60s even. Speakers not being allowed on campus, demands for 50 Black studies posts in the university, with Black Panthers showing up with weapons going into university offices. I mean, everything we're seeing now, I don't think it's that different. I mean, it is essentially an anti-intellectual protest movement with sacred values around race, gender. Now, yes, trans is new, and race was the first pillar. That remains the highest value on the totem pole in terms of a category. So I think that's a constant. Sexuality has been there since the 60s or since the 70s. Gender and sexuality, certainly. So I think that the sanctification and the sacralization of these symbols, and it's what's interesting is it's a hierarchy. So race is above gender and sexuality. Gender and sexuality, it's not clear who's above who. For example, you will have Black figures within the gay movement who will attack gays as being white, as too white, and the leaders as being, representing only white gays. And then you will have, but what you won't have, for example, is feminists attacking rap artists and saying that they are misogynist, which of course very often they are. I mean, so there is very much a hierarchy of who gets to attack who, because who has got more victimhood points than who on this totem pole. And I think that this idea of rank ordering of victimhood on an identity totem pole of sanctity, I mean, that is sort of at core to this religion and has been core all the way back into the 60s, where, by the way, you will see that there were people who were canceled even in the 70s. So, for example, James Coleman questioned the policy of busing children from Black inner city schools to white suburban schools, and people stood on stage and called him a Nazi and things. So this was already happening. But I think what happens now is it's just easier to organize these flash mobs through social media and partisan media. It's just faster. There are now more institutionalized. You have diversity, equity and diversity officers in universities who can push this agenda. So the whole thing has just got more and more entrenched. But I think the ideas are not so different from what they were.
Perhaps you could elaborate. You mentioned it also in passing the free speech codes on several American campuses, which I know you actually, if I recall correctly, you're writing that they are actually unconstitutional as regarding the U.S. Constitution. I think that's something which would be probably very foreign to people familiar with Danish academia. Could you try to elaborate on what that is?
Well, these are simply codes of conduct that are maintained in universities. Now, I think these are mainly violations of people's right to free speech, which is very strongly protected in the U.S. Constitution, although that only applies to those working in government-funded universities, not private universities like Harvard and about a lot of the elite universities. But I think these things also exist I would bet that in Danish universities, they have policies on work and study. They might be called something like policies on work and study, and you can't harass somebody or bring the university's reputation into disrepute. Now that you might say, well, you don't want people harassing people, but then what is the definition of harassment? Well, someone feels harassed. So somebody who is trans could say, well, they're discussing whether their biological sex is related to gender, and I feel harassed, and so I'm going to file a complaint. You see, so it's all about stretching definitions. And so I would suspect that even within Denmark, the policies exist that in some way essentially violate people's free speech rights, that a policy might say you can't bring the university into disrepute, you can't harass, and that the interpretation of the meaning of those words, harassment and disrepute, might be elastic enough that someone could weaponize that and use that to shut down your speech. So I think these policies may be in place, and you just may not realize that they're there. And all it takes is an activist to push on that button, and suddenly you realize that you're vulnerable.
I think you might have some very broadly worded things, but perhaps the difference is that, I mean, we have hate speech codes in our penal code, which is actually, as we speak, being extended to cover trans people. I mean, it's a kind of a group-based protection again for various minorities, which is also somewhat selectively enforced. So that might be one of the differences. I don't think I've ever encountered some specific free speech code on when I was studying, but that was quite a few years ago. One thing I was thinking about, what are what would you say are the warning signs about regarding this kind of wokeism in trend making inroads into academia? What should one be noticing in a place such as Denmark?
Well, I think you want to keep an eye out for any open letters that are trying to get universities to fire a professor or to demote a professor. And when the university caves into that pressure, that to me is a sort of immediately you know you've seen cancel culture in action. Or similarly with not letting a speaker speak on campus because of their views. Again, now, if somebody's invited and then disinvited, I think that's another example. But I think too much can sometimes be made of, I think this is a huge threat. But it's also, the other thing I would say is you also want to look at things that are harder to see. So surveys of academics and students to say, how free do you feel to express your views in class? In the US case, only 1 in 10 Trump supporting academics said they feel free to express that view to a colleague. And 85% of the Democrat, which is the overwhelming majority of professors, agree with them. They say, yeah, someone who supported Trump wouldn't express that view. So one of the indicators is freedom. Do people feel free to express a conservative view in class or to colleagues? The other thing is, what is the political tilt in your university? Of course it's going to tilt left, but how left? And how much discrimination is there in hiring? And if somebody is a known conservative, do they have trouble getting their papers published, getting promoted, getting hired, etc.? These are things which are only surveys will reveal. And that's why you need to have these surveys, I think, conducted in your universities to actually get a sense. So work in Germany, for example, shows that there's a very similar thing happening there as is happening in Britain and the US. So you have very powerful, a very large number of people not feeling free to express their views. And also, by the way, asking people, if you ask students, should such a person be allowed to speak on campus, who say, I don't know, thinks that being trans is a mental illness or something. To take an extreme case, should such a person be allowed on campus? And just to see sort of what are the levels of intolerance for what may be a very offensive speaker, but still willingness to engage with opposing viewpoints. And I think you would find a lot of, I don't know, we'll see, but I would have thought you'd find a lot of intolerance amongst the student body for this kind of speaker.
I think one of the very interesting things about, I just read previous to us speaking, I read your piece in Colette, which is called The Threat to Academic Freedom from Anecdotes to Data. It's also linked on the front page of Kontrast.dk. But it's one of the interesting things is that in Denmark, that simply haven't been, and not as far as I'm aware of, and I think I would have noticed, but I might be wrong, though I don't think so. There haven't been done any major studies of political orientation, or whether people feel unwilling to or afraid to express their viewpoints in the classroom. So it's very interesting because, of course, I have a master's degree in journalism, and I also studied history and the history of ideas. And anecdotally, I could say that there seemed to be a somewhat left-wing tilt, I can say, and that's rather an understatement, but I don't think there is the substantial data. But one thing I was wondering is in Denmark, I think one of the things that we're that is at least my impression is that much of this activist student culture or the wokeness culture seems to be very much imported from an American discourse and an American academic discourse. We have a Black Lives Matter movement in Denmark, which is pretty much paraphrasing American ideas about cop killings and systemic racism within the authorities. But Denmark doesn't really have any slave past in the sense that's comparable to the US, because even though Denmark had colonies and did participate in the slave trade, no Black people came to Denmark. Our immigrants are people who are mainly refugees or working migrants who came since the 1960s. So, I mean, is it your sense that in the UK, where you work and teach, that it's also this kind of imported US product, or is it somehow, I mean, is there a British version of wokeism and cancel culture?
Well, yes, it is imported, but I think the idea of left modernism, this idea that you are talking about oppressed identity groups, that is really, it's really about a totem pole of sacred values in which it's all about protecting what are seen to be sacred identity groups, and you have the oppressor group, which is the majority white or male or straight kind of oppressor group. And this is the narrative. And I think actually you can see it that it adapts in each country. Like in Canada, it might focus more on the Aboriginal people, for example, and all the things that were done to them in the past. And that becomes the basis for saying the country is systematically racist. In Britain, it's the British Empire. That becomes slavery, British Empire. Yes, they didn't have Jim Crow and segregation, but, you had slavery. And then maybe in Denmark, I don't know, maybe they'll look to find whatever they can find. Maybe it'll be immigrant. Maybe it will be some episode way in the past. There should be some material that they can work with to try and bolster this narrative of oppressor and oppressed identity groups. So I would think it will, the tone will shift. I think this is fundamentally about an ideology, though, and even though the U.S., because of its racial past, the Black Lives Matter side of things is more prominent, I still think that this has its very strong kind of domestic roots in each country. This is about the cultural left adapting, looking at the past of the country, looking at the social divisions, and saying, what can we work with to try and create this narrative?
You also mentioned the idea put forward by John McWhorter, he's an American linguist and also an author. I think he published a book called Losing Race quite a few years ago. He's also a brilliant linguist. I can highly recommend his book, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue About English. It details how Danish actually messed up the English language, which is a wonderful thing to be responsible for. But I mean, he has this idea that at its core, this idea of wokeism is basically a religious movement, and you seem to be, with your definition, your exemplary one sentence definition of wokeism, you seem to be agreeing. Is that also how you view this phenomenon, that it's basically something which has more in common with a religious worldview than what you could call perhaps a rational or intellectual worldview?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very much about a total, there's good and evil. So there is maybe the good, let's just say, minorities, typically people of color and to some degree women or sexual minority. And then you have the bad, which is the white male, etc. Black and white is a very simplistic framework. So for example, we just had a report come out, a government report here. The British government now is trying to push back on this discourse a little bit. And there's a report that said, well, Britain is, there is racism in Britain, but it is not an institutionally racist society or a systemically racist society. And this caused an enormous uproar from the sort of race industry and progressive Twitter and so on. How can you say this? And really what this is about religion, right? It's about saying you have denied our sacred value, which is that this society is a racist, systemically racist society. Now, what does systemic mean? So the commissioners were trying to take a scientific approach to say, well, it looks like Chinese and Indian kids are doing better than white kids here. And then in another place on health, maybe the whites are doing a little better here. And so they quantified everything. And they said, sometimes it's about, intact families. That's why Black African kids do so much better than Black Caribbean kids. Or sometimes it's about, how much money the group had when it immigrated to the country, or maybe sometimes it is racism. They wanted to simply be scientific about it using numbers and data. And that shows in a way that the difference between the opponents for whom it's an article of faith, this is not something you can question, that Britain is a racist society. That's the starting point, right? And these commissioners who were saying, well, let's see how racist, where it's racist. No, it's either all or nothing. And you can't, and one of the things that comes out, for example, is, say, if you take Black British people, racial discrimination that they experience, 40% of it comes from other non-white British people. Again, that's not something that fits in within a simple white-Black story. How is it the case that or a disproportionate amount of the discrimination that is being experienced by Black Britons is coming from non-white people? That doesn't fit the story. Or Asians doing well. In America, they're earning more than white. That doesn't fit the story, because you have to constantly have a simple story, and we don't want complexity and nuance. It's got to be simple. And so that's kind of shows you the difference between a scientific worldview where it's about, okay, we want to identify the problem, we want to fix it. An example is longer sentences for Black people in the court system. Well, one of the problems is that they're pleading not guilty instead of pleading guilty at a much higher rate. So maybe the solution is actually, can we somehow get them better legal advice so that they plead guilty instead of not guilty, and they'll get a reduced sentence? That kind of approach that is sort of scientific is rejected in favor of these totalizing system is rigged, it's all racist, right? So, and that kind of shows you the difference between the religious worldview and the more rational worldview.
I think I'll take a few questions from the viewers afterwards, but I just have one final question. But if any of the viewers want to pose a question or want me to pose a question to Eric, please write it in the comments. But one thing that I noticed on I think actually it was on your own Twitter feed, was that exposure to critical race theory, which is this what can I say, overarching component of wokeness, seems to actually be lowering and you quoted data on it, seems to be actually lowering self-esteem among young Black people. Can you elaborate on the findings in that regard, and perhaps also what the causality would be?
Well, yeah, so we already have studies that show that perceiving that you live in a racist society has a negative impact psychologically on members of minority groups' health, for example, and other kinds of outcomes. And then what I sought to do was say, okay, so if we look at a writer like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's an example of this critical race theory writer who very much has a message that says the police are out to shoot you and get you and commit violence. The US as a country is all about violence against the Black body, right? So this is the sort of way in which Coates tends to write. And this is sort of fits in with that critical race paradigm that says, you know, there is the oppressor, the white oppressor, and then there is the minority victim. And that's the structure of society. So what I did was essentially, we did what's called a survey experiment where, you know, to put it crudely, say half the people read a paragraph from Ta-Nehisi Coates talking about Black victimhood at the hands of whites and white police and so on. And then you have another group that reads something else that's maybe a mild paragraph. And you compare, we then ask them about what the psychologists call self-efficacy, you know, empowerment. How much do you feel in control of your life? In this case, a question might be, I feel that I can make my life plans work out. Just a general question. And what you saw is that the ones who read the Ta-Nehisi Coates, only 68% of them agreed that they could make their life plans work out. Whereas those who didn't read the critical race theory, it was 82%. And this study, I conducted one in 2018, one in 2020, same result in both cases. So it's not a fluke, and it's highly significant statistically. It's a very strong effect. So what I think this is just demonstrating, just reading one paragraph, if you're a Black American, you read this paragraph from a critical race theory writer, your sense of self-belief drops substantially. Now, if you imagine a society where that message is coming at you from television, from music, from education, from newspapers, what effect is that going to have on the success, you know, self-belief, which is actually a key component of how well people do in society? It's going to reduce trust in police, trust in institutions. So just to suggest that this is actually, if critical race theory is supposed to be about helping Black people, it really seems to be having the opposite effect.
Okay, I'll take a question. We have Emmanuel. He's asking, as a young conservative choosing a major, would you recommend avoiding humanities and political sciences as a whole to stay away from leftist identity politics and rather pursue other fields?
Well, it's very difficult to know what to suggest. I mean, I think that, you know, if you look at, you know, one of the slides there I had from Langbert, you know, the most extreme tilt will be in sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, and then psychology. You know, political science typically comes out as probably one of the better, or perhaps one of the more balanced fields within the social sciences. I mean, economics would be the most balanced, but it would still be, in the US case, about 4 or 5 to 1 left to right, even in economics. But political science might be about 8 to 1, but compared to psychology, 16 to 1, or anthropology, which would be, you know, essentially all left. So political science would be your best bet, I would say. In the humanities, very hard to say. Perhaps philosophy is maybe better. but it depends on the department. It depends how open-minded. I mean, if someone's on the left, but they're open-minded and they're not reactive and they don't see you as a bad person for having different ideas, that's what you want. You know, you don't necessarily have to have a place where there's a lot of conservatives, but what you can't have, even a small number of intolerant, bigoted left modernists is enough to poison the atmosphere. Even one or two in a room of 10 or 15 is enough to poison the entire atmosphere. So I think the key is really to avoid environments where you have a significant presence of these very intolerant left modernists.
And then we have a question from Lasse about what I think could be is normally termed woke capitalism. Isn't it something new that we see the big companies take the woke values and promote them? And how powerful do you see this trend?
Well, people say it's new, and I think again, it's a scale issue. I think you could see even in the 1990s that major corporations wanted to be seen to be doing things on equality and diversity. Even in the 90s, there's always been this link between kind of bohemian left modernist radicalism and certainly the knowledge industries, some corporations, advertising, media, and so on. There's always been some flow. So, you know, the Black Panthers in the 60s, they were feted by Vogue and fashion magazines. You know, so I think it's not as new as people say it is. I mean, corporations have always wanted to be a little bit woke. I just think it's gotten extreme when they're being overtly political, you know, like the National Football League and Nike and these companies are just more than they used to be, perhaps. They're virtue signaling more than ever. I don't think it's as new as people say, because I think the left modernism as an ideology has always been quite friendly to capitalism in many ways. It can be adapted very easily to capitalism. And this mix of bohemianism and bourgeois has been going on for, Daniel Bell wrote about it in the 60s and certainly in the 90s. So I think it's, like a lot of these trends, it's simply an acceleration, but I don't think it's new.
If I'm not mistaken, I actually think that Andrew Heath and a guy named Potter, who are Canadians also, they wrote a book called The Rebel Cell 15 years ago about how capitalism is always able to somehow incorporate woke values and just use it to sell stuff. That seems to be a quite efficient mechanism. One last question I have before I'm going to let you go is you were interviewed in the New Yorker magazine about what you termed white identity politics, and I mean I think for many people that's like somewhat of a touchy issue, because when you think about white identity politics, I mean, yeah, you can say black pride, but white pride, that doesn't really have the same ring to it. And I mean, but you made the case for this kind of moderate white identity politics. Could you try to elaborate?
I mean, the point about identity on its own is only a problem if it becomes extreme. And that's as much the case for minority as majority identities. So the problem that I would have is not with, say, someone who's black being proud of being black, identifying with that, wanting the best for his group. I don't think that's the problem. I mean, the differences between what Jonathan Haidt would call a common enemy version of identity versus a common humanity version. So if you're just proud of your black traditions or your ethnic Danish traditions, and but you don't, just because you're attached to your own group doesn't make you hate other groups. In fact, the psychology and the research on this is very clear that unless there's a war situation, generally speaking, it's like if I'm really attached to my family, that doesn't make me hate the neighbors anymore. And similarly, we can look in the US, you know, white people who are attached to being white are no more anti-black than white people who aren't attached to being white. Being attached to being white in America, for example, or in Britain or any country is usually an offshoot of ethnic identification. So if someone's really as proud of being Irish American or Italian American, they tend to be very much more attached to being white. It's a bit like being Danish and European. So I mean, I know it doesn't work exactly that way, but essentially this is not in and of itself is not a toxic thing. The problem is if you're identity and what you're trying to do with your identity is it's based on I hate this person. And what I see the left modernists doing is encouraging a common enemy form of identity. So the identity is not the problem. The problem is a common enemy. So your enemy is the white group, the majority. You should see yourself as fighting and struggling against that group, and that's how you should define yourself. Person of color, even though person of color may not be very meaningful to this person. And similarly with whereas at the same time, what they're trying to do to the white identity is say, this is toxic and shameful. If you identify as white, which about 40 to 60% of, say, white Americans have a white identity, then you are an awful person. Well, actually, no, this is, in American society, for example, the different European groups have mixed together so much. Socially, this is a real category. It's okay to have an identity with that, as long as it's about common humanity. So we're okay with interracial marriage. We're fine with that. We have pride in our past, as any other group has pride in their past, but we're not going to fetishize and hate somebody else. I mean, so that is sort of the point I was trying to make, was that attachment to own group for a majority or for a minority, it works the same way. It's about attachment to who you are. It becomes a problem when it's defined as I hate this other group.
Eric Kaufmann, thank you very much for lending us your time and giving us your insights. It's been very, very interesting. And of course, as I failed to mention in the introduction, you are the author of a lot of books, but the latest one is White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities from 2018. Thank you very much, Eric. I'm going to switch into Danish now, but once again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mickey. Thank you.
Så vil jeg bare lige sige til alle jer, der ser med her, hvis jeg ellers skal undgå at få mit hoved alt for meget ind i solen, så håber jeg, I fandt det her lige så interessant, som jeg gjorde. Vi fortsætter vores temauge her på Kontrast om identitetspolitik i uddannelsessystemet, og så håber jeg på, I vil se med på torsdag, når vi har Douglas Murray med kl. 17. Og så synes jeg ellers, I skulle have en rigtig god dag. Tak for nu.